Have you ever wondered why God allowed someone you loved, trusted, or depended on to walk away, leaving you with a pain that felt heavier than your own body could carry? Why would a God who sees every tear and hears every silent prayer let a person be removed from your life in such a painful way? These are the moments when your heart begs for clarity, yet heaven seems quiet. But what if the very departure that broke you was the doorway God used to protect you, redirect you, and awaken you to a truth you would have never seen while that person was still standing beside you? Pain has a language of revelation, and sometimes God speaks the loudest through what he takes away rather than what he gives. There are seasons when God sees conversations you never heard, intentions you never discerned, and spiritual dangers you were never meant to fight. And instead of letting your heart stay tied to something that would shrink your calling or weaken your purpose, he steps in and permits a separation that feels brutal but carries divine strategy. The closed door is not rejection. The distance is not abandonment. The removal is not punishment. It is God intercepting a future you could not see, shielding you from battles that were never yours to fight, and creating space for healing that could only begin once that person was gone. And maybe the pain feels sharp because your soul wasn't just losing a relationship, it was losing an identity built around that relationship. When God removes someone, he is not subtracting your worth, he is restoring it. He is recalibrating your heart so you stop anchoring yourself in people who cannot carry the weight of your destiny. You begin to realize that some connections were seasonal, some were assignments, and some were simply mirrors showing what still needed healing inside you. What you are feeling right now is not just grief. It is spiritual realignment. It is God pulling you out of what was limiting you so he can lead you into what will finally grow you. If this resonates in your spirit, take a moment to breathe and ask yourself, have you ever felt God removing someone to protect your purpose? You can share your own experience in the comments, because your story may speak to someone who is hurting right now. And do not forget to like this video and check if you are already subscribed so you do not miss the next messages that will strengthen your journey. As you reflect on this moment, allow your heart to stay open, because what comes next in this message will take you even deeper into why God allows such painful separations and how they become the turning points of your destiny. When someone is removed from your life and the shock finally settles, there comes a moment when you begin to see the quiet truth beneath the pain. The departure did not just expose the person who left, it exposed something inside you. Pain has a way of pulling back the curtain on what your spirit has been trying to ignore. Sometimes God allows a separation because the presence of that person was keeping you from hearing what he had been whispering all along. You may not have noticed how their influence shaped your decisions, how their voice gradually drowned out God's voice, or how their approval became the compass you followed instead of the direction God was trying to give you. It is often only after they leave that clarity begins to rise like light through a cracked door. This is the moment when God begins to reveal that the relationship was not as aligned as you once believed. You start recognizing patterns you justified, red flags you minimized, and emotional weights you carried as if they were normal. When God steps in and permits a painful removal, he is not exposing the other person to shame them. He is exposing spiritual misalignment so that you can finally see the truth with unfiltered eyes. Often the person who left was tied to an older version of you, a version God is now calling you to outgrow. Their presence was familiar, but your future requires transformation, not familiarity, and transformation rarely happens in comfort. God knows that some connections slow your spiritual growth because they feed your insecurities rather than your purpose. Some relationships anchor you to cycles you were never meant to repeat. Some people pull you into emotional chaos that keeps your heart too distracted to recognize divine direction. The pain of their absence is not punishment. It is purification. It is God clearing the space around your soul so that He can plant something deeper, stronger, and more aligned with the person He is shaping you to become. Every time you feel the ache of what was lost, something inside you is being rebuilt. Discernment, strength, identity, and the ability to recognize what is truly from God. And slowly, almost quietly, you begin to understand that the removal was never meant to make you feel abandoned. It was meant to reveal what was happening. Beneath the surface, God was not taking someone from you, He was returning you to yourself. And as this truth unfolds in your heart, it prepares you for the deeper revelation that comes next, the part of the journey where God begins to show how every loss carries a hidden assignment, and how what felt like an ending is actually opening the way for something far more aligned with your destiny. There comes a moment, after the initial shock of someone's departure fades, when you begin to realize something unexpected. The removal itself was an answer to prayers you did not even know you were praying. You asked God for clarity, for peace, for alignment, for a deeper sense of purpose. You asked Him to guide your steps, heal your heart, and protect your future. What you did not realize is that sometimes the answer to those prayers comes in forms that feel like loss. God heard every whisper you spoke, even the ones buried beneath exhaustion, confusion, and quiet desperation. And in His wisdom, He responded not by adjusting your emotions, but by adjusting your environment. When God removes someone, it is often because their presence would interfere with the healing you asked for. Their influence might have been shaping you in ways that pulled you further from God's direction. Their patterns might have been reinforcing wounds God intended to close. Their words might have been clouding your discernment, making you doubt what God planted in you. And though you may not have had the strength to walk away on your own, God stepped into the situation and did what you could not bring yourself to do. What looked like abandonment was actually divine intervention. Many times you asked God for growth, yet growth requires pruning. You asked Him for restoration, yet restoration requires removal. You asked Him for strength, yet strength is forged in spaces where old attachments no longer support you. You asked Him to reveal the truth, yet truth is often unveiled when someone exits your life rather than when they remain. God answers prayers not by preserving what is familiar, but by protecting what is sacred within you. And when the person leaves, something within your spirit shifts. You start to realize how much emotional weight you were carrying, how often you ignored your own needs to maintain a fragile peace, how deeply you compromised, how drained you felt without even noticing. Their absence becomes the beginning of your awakening. God opens your eyes to patterns you tolerated out of hope, fear, or loyalty. He shows you how much energy was spent trying to fix what was never meant to be yours to repair. Slowly, you begin to understand that the unanswered questions, the sudden silence, even the painful distance were all working together to fulfill what you once asked God for: clarity, healing, and alignment with your true destiny. And just when you begin to grasp this truth, another layer emerges. God not only removed the person, but He is now preparing you for something deeper, something that will transform how you see every separation. And this next revelation begins to unfold as your spirit adjusts to what God is getting ready to reveal. There comes a point in your healing journey when you begin to recognize that God does not simply remove people to answer prayers or expose truth. Sometimes He removes them to protect you from a future you were not meant to carry. Pain becomes a barrier God uses to stop you from crossing into territory that would have drained your purpose, distorted your identity, or delayed your destiny. You may think you were strong enough to handle the connection, wise enough to manage the relationship, or loyal enough to keep trying, But God saw what was coming long before you did. He saw the emotional erosion that would have taken place if you continued, the spiritual confusion that would have deepened, and the subtle compromises that would have reshaped your heart in ways you were not designed to endure. Sometimes God intervenes because the attachment was growing faster than your discernment. You were beginning to trust their voice more than His. You were starting to shape your decisions around their approval rather than divine direction. And once God sees that a relationship is steering your heart away from the clarity He intends for you, He steps in, not with gentle nudges but with firm separation. Pain becomes the instrument He uses to pull you away from what would have slowly unraveled your spirit. It is difficult to see this protection when you are standing in the middle of grief, holding memories that feel warm and wounds that feel open. But as time passes, you begin to notice the signs you once dismissed. You realize how much anxiety you carried without acknowledging it. You see how often you tried to justify what your soul quietly rejected. You remember the nights you felt unseen, undervalued, or spiritually disconnected, even while trying to stay loyal. And slowly, the removal starts to look less like abandonment and more like rescue. God knows that some people cannot go where He is taking you next, not because they are evil, but because their presence would have conflicted with your calling. Some relationships drain the strength you are meant to use for your purpose. Some connections create noise that drowns out God's whisper. Some attachments keep you tied to emotional patterns that block the transformation God is trying to produce in you. The separation feels painful because your heart is being stretched into a new level of dependence on God, a level that would have never been reached if the person had stayed. And as your spirit adjusts to this new reality, something surprising happens. You begin to sense that God did not just remove someone, He is rewiring your discernment. Your sensitivity to His voice becomes sharper, your boundaries grow stronger, your expectations of love begin to shift. And this awakening prepares you for the next layer of truth, the revelation that what felt like the end was actually the beginning of a deeper spiritual realignment that God is about to unfold in the next part of this journey. Before we continue, share in the comments if you have ever realized later that God removed someone to protect you. Your story may help someone who is hurting right now. As you continue to walk through the ache of someone's absence, you begin to discover that God does not only remove people to shield your future, He also uses their departure to reveal the wounds within you that were silently shaping your choices. Pain has a way of uncovering what comfort keeps hidden. When someone leaves, the emotions that rise, fear of abandonment, insecurity, unworthiness, confusion, or even self-blame, are not random reactions. They are spiritual indicators of places God has been wanting to heal for years. The separation becomes a mirror, showing you the deeper layers of your heart with honesty you may have never confronted if the relationship had remained intact. Sometimes you realize that you stayed connected because you feared being alone, not because the relationship was healthy, or you notice how much you depended on their validation to feel secure. You may even see how much of yourself you silenced to keep the peace, how often you carried emotional burdens that were never yours, or how deeply you overlooked your own needs while trying to keep the connection alive. When God removes someone, He is often exposing the emotional agreements you made without noticing. Agreements like believing you must earn love, hide your feelings, accept inconsistency, or settle for relationships that cannot support the weight of your soul. And in this revelation, something profound begins. God starts healing wounds you never prayed about but desperately needed restored. The loneliness you feared becomes the space where God gives you new identity. The emptiness you dreaded becomes the soil where spiritual strength begins to grow. You start understanding that your worth was never determined by who stayed or who left. It was always rooted in the God who has never abandoned you for a single moment. Slowly your spirit begins to shift. What once felt like a loss now feels like unveiling. You become aware of patterns, people-pleasing, emotional overgiving, silence in moments when you needed to speak, or clinging to relationships that reflected your wounds more than your worth. This awareness is not punishment. It is transformation. God is not revealing these wounds to shame you, but to restore you, to rebuild the parts of your heart that were shaped around survival instead of purpose. And as this healing deepens, something else becomes clear. Losing that person was not the end of your story. It was the beginning of God reshaping your emotional foundation, preparing you to receive relationships that align with your identity rather than your wounds. This inner rebuilding sets the stage for what God will uncover next, a deeper understanding of how separation becomes preparation for the chapters He is writing ahead of you. As the layers of healing begin to settle, you start to realize that every separation God allowed was not merely about who left, but about who you are becoming. The removal was not only a moment of loss, it was a moment of preparation. You may not have seen it at first, but God was clearing space in your life, not to leave you empty, but to ready you for new chapters that require a stronger, clearer, more spiritually aligned version of you. What felt like an ending was actually the restructuring of your inner world, the quiet reordering of your priorities, values, and spiritual sensitivity. Before God opens a new door, He often closes one that your heart was never going to close on its own. There are chapters in your destiny that cannot begin until certain relationships end. Not because the people involved were evil, but because their presence kept you anchored to seasons that no longer fit your calling. You cannot step into the next level of your purpose while carrying the weight of patterns that belong to your past. Separation becomes the threshold where God begins reconditioning your identity. You start gaining clarity about what you want, what you can no longer accept, and what aligns with the direction God is shaping in you. You begin to see how much emotional real estate was occupied by people who could not grow with you. Their exit reveals the space you now have, space to think with clarity, space to heal without interference, space to listen to God without emotional noise clouding your discernment. And in that new space, God begins strengthening qualities that were weakened by old connections: confidence, spiritual authority, self-respect, boundaries, patience, and the ability to recognize His voice above your own desires. This preparation is not passive. It is a divine recalibration. God uses the silence after departure to awaken gifts you forgot you had, to revive dreams that were suffocated under emotional weight, and to reconnect you with parts of your calling that had gone dormant. You begin noticing that your prayers shift, your expectations shift, even the way you view relationships shifts. The person you are becoming would not have survived in the environment you once desperately tried to hold together. And just when you begin settling into this new awareness, another realization emerges. God is not only preparing you for future relationships, but for assignments that require a version of you made resilient through loss. What He allowed to be removed was never meant to be permanent, because He is shaping you into someone who can walk confidently into a season that demands spiritual strength, emotional clarity, and a heart no longer tied to what was. And as this preparation unfolds, it leads directly into the next revelation: how discernment sharpens through pain, and why understanding this shift is essential for everything God is about to reveal next. As you continue moving through this quiet reconstruction of your heart, something else begins to surface: discernment. Not the kind you once relied on, shaped by emotion or hope, but a deeper, sharper, spiritually awakened discernment that grows only after loss has stripped away illusions. When God allows someone to be removed through pain, that separation becomes a spiritual recalibration of your inner compass. What once confused you now becomes clear. What once felt acceptable now feels misaligned. The version of you that tolerated inconsistency, dishonesty, or emotional instability can no longer survive in the environment God is shaping for your future. Discernment often emerges from the very wounds you wished God would spare you from. Pain teaches your eyes to see differently. You begin noticing subtle patterns, the tone behind someone's words, the shift in their energy, the way your spirit reacts even when your emotions want to ignore the warning. You start recognizing when someone is drawn to your potential but not committed to your growth, when they appreciate your presence but cannot handle your purpose, when they enjoy your light but cannot carry its responsibility. And then something profound happens. What once attracted you no longer holds power over you. You recognize emotional manipulation quicker. You sense spiritual misalignment before it becomes entanglement. You feel the difference between a person who comes to add weight to your journey and a person who comes to lighten it. This new discernment is not born from suspicion, but from clarity. The clarity God forged in you through the departure you thought would break you. You begin to understand that discernment is not the ability to judge others. It is the ability to protect what God is building within you. Every painful goodbye became a tool God used to sharpen your spiritual perception. Every unanswered question trained your faith to rely on God more than explanations. Every moment you felt lost prepared you to recognize truth the moment it appears. And with this new discernment, your heart prepares for deeper alignment. You realize that you no longer fear losing people because you now understand that anyone God removes was never assigned to your destiny. You do not cling out of panic, you release out of wisdom. You do not chase, you observe. You do not settle, you wait for what carries peace, not confusion. This awakened discernment becomes the bridge into the next revelation, the understanding that God removes not only to protect and prepare, but to make space for what He intends to send, something your spirit is now finally ready to recognize. And as this realization settles in, take a moment to reflect on your own journey. If you have ever felt your discernment sharpen after losing someone, share your experience in the comments. Your story may be the clarity someone else needs right now. As your discernment sharpens and your spirit grows more aware of what aligns and what no longer fits, something unexpected begins to unfold. The very space created by someone's absence becomes the opening through which God begins to send what is truly meant for your life. Loss clears room in ways comfort never could. When a person leaves, it may feel as though something essential has been taken from you, but over time, you begin to sense a quiet rearranging, a subtle expansion, an inner readiness for what God has been preparing behind the scenes. The removal was not just about protecting you, it was about creating the margin necessary for new purpose, new peace, and new relationships that carry divine assignment rather than emotional weight. It is often in the emptiness left behind that God begins His deepest work. You start noticing shifts within yourself. Your standards rise, your emotional boundaries strengthen, your sense of identity becomes clearer. The version of you that once accepted crumbs now recognizes the value of receiving something whole. The version of you that tolerated inconsistency now craves stability rooted in truth. The version of you that once clung to unhealthy attachments now recognizes the importance of alignment over familiarity. That space inside you, once filled by a person who was never meant to stay, becomes fertile ground for something God ordained. You also begin to see how God orchestrates timing with precision. What you viewed as an abrupt ending was actually the opening act of a transition. You start to sense opportunities that were previously blocked by emotional entanglements. You feel an internal pull toward growth, toward healthier environments, toward people who speak to your purpose rather than your pain. Slowly, you realize that if the person had stayed, the blessings now approaching would have had no place to land. God did not just remove someone, He cleared the pathway for what carries your future. This shift does not happen overnight. It unfolds quietly, layer by layer, like dawn breaking after a long night. You notice how much lighter your spirit feels, how much more space you have to dream again, how your connection with God deepens now that the noise that once clouded your discernment has faded. And even though part of you may still grieve what was lost, another part begins to recognize the beauty of what is forming. You realize that God is not preparing you merely to receive something new, but to recognize it, value it, and guard it with the wisdom shaped through heartbreak. And as this awareness expands within you, a new anticipation rises. Not the anxious hope you once felt, but a grounded expectation that whatever God brings next will not compete with your peace, dilute your purpose, or drain your spirit. It will fit in a way that feels like clarity rather than chaos. This understanding prepares your heart for the next revelation, where the silence after loss becomes a sacred territory of transformation, shaping you into someone capable of receiving what God has been aligning for your life all along. As the space created by someone's absence continues to shift your inner world, a new phase of your journey begins. The quiet season after loss, the territory where silence speaks louder than words and solitude becomes a spiritual classroom. This silence is not emptiness. It is a refining ground. When the noise of a relationship fades, your spirit is finally able to hear what it could not hear before. You start to recognize that the stillness is not punishment, but preparation, not abandonment, but alignment. God often does His deepest work in the moments when everything around you feels motionless, because silence forces you to confront the parts of yourself that were buried beneath distraction, attachment, or emotional dependency. In this sacred quiet, layers begin to surface. You notice feelings you never processed, dreams you suppressed to keep peace, and desires you silenced to maintain connection. The absence of another person reveals the presence of your own soul in ways you had not acknowledged. God uses this stillness to show you where healing is still needed, where boundaries must be rebuilt, and where strength must be cultivated. You start to understand that solitude does not mean you are alone. It means God finally has your undivided attention. This transformation is often subtle. You begin waking up with a clearer mind. Your emotions stabilize. Your thoughts grow more aligned with truth rather than fear. The parts of you that once felt fragile begin to gain resilience. You no longer seek validation from external voices because God is quietly restoring your sense of identity from within. What once triggered you now teaches you. What once destabilized you now reveals how much progress has already taken place. In the silence, you also begin to reinterpret the past. You see more clearly why certain conversations unsettled your spirit, why certain patterns drained your energy, and why certain people could not stay. The silence becomes a lens that sharpens your understanding of what was misaligned. It is here that God begins redefining what love, connection, and emotional safety should truly feel like. What once felt familiar no longer feels acceptable. What once felt comfortable now feels limiting. This shift is not accidental, it is spiritual evolution. And slowly, the silence that once felt heavy becomes the very place where your strength is. Rebuilt, you find yourself thinking differently, praying differently, choosing differently. The person you were before the loss is no longer the person emerging now. This new version of you is steadier, clearer, more discerning, and more aligned with the person God has been shaping through every layer of heartache and revelation. As this transformation settles into your spirit, a new understanding begins to rise within you. The realization that everything God removed, everything He allowed, and everything He restored has been guiding you toward a greater purpose. And this awareness becomes the threshold of what comes next, where the true meaning behind every painful separation finally begins to unfold. As all the layers of this journey begin to weave together, you start to see the full picture that was hidden in every loss, every unanswered question, every silent night when you wondered why God allowed someone to be removed from your life. What once felt like abandonment now reveals itself as divine alignment. What once felt like the collapse of your emotional world now appears as the precise moment God began rebuilding you from the inside out. Every separation carried purpose. Every closed door redirected your path. Every painful goodbye cleared space for a life that reflects who you truly are, rather than who you were forced to be in the presence of those who could not stay. You begin to realize that God was never taking people from you to leave you empty. He was making sure that only the relationships aligned with your calling would remain. There were connections that could not follow you into the future He is preparing, not because of their flaws, but because of your growth. Some relationships were bridges, not destinations. Some people were lessons, not lifelong companions. And some departures were the very hand of God protecting you from futures that would have drained your spirit and delayed your purpose. Now, standing in this clearer space within your soul, you sense a quiet assurance rising in you. You see how loss matured your faith, sharpened your discernment, steadied your emotions, and taught you to depend on God in ways comfort never could. You are no longer defined by who left, because you finally understand that your identity is rooted in the God who stayed. This realization marks the beginning of a new chapter, not one built from desperation, but from alignment, clarity, and spiritual strength. And as you breathe into this truth, you recognize that the same God who allowed certain people to walk away is the God who is now guiding you into relationships, opportunities, and seasons that carry peace instead of confusion, alignment instead of imbalance, purpose instead of emotional exhaustion. What felt like a breaking was actually a becoming. What felt like loss was preparation. What felt like the end was the turning point of your destiny. If you have walked with me through this entire message, then your heart already knows this transformation is real, and that God has been shaping you in ways you may not even fully see yet. And as we close this part of the journey, let this moment be an anchor. If this content has brought clarity or strength to your spirit, consider subscribing so you can continue receiving what supports your growth. Leave a comment using the phrase, "This message was for me, so I know you made it to the end," and so your words can encourage someone else who needs it. And if this message resonated with your soul, give it a like to help these truths reach more people who are searching for direction. There is another video waiting for you right now that continues this journey in a deeper way. And if you feel led, click and keep walking with me as we move into the next chapter of what God is preparing for your life.